The wind carried dust across the wide plains, brushing against the porch railings of the old ranch house. Out here, where silence stretched as far as the horizon, every sound felt louder: the rustle of dry grass, the creak of the barn door, the lonely howl of a coyote. It was the kind of place where secrets could be buried deep and stay hidden for years, yet also the kind of place where every glance and whisper seemed to matter more than in any bustling town. She stepped off the wagon with her satchel clutched tight, certain this job was going to be nothing more than long hours in a hot kitchen. That was all she signed up for. Cooking, baking bread, keeping a rancher fed. Nothing more, nothing less. Or so she thought. The man waiting for her wasn't like the townsfolk she'd known. He stood tall, shoulders broad from years of work, with a quiet authority that filled the air around him. His eyes weren't cold, but they held something she couldn't quite name: a wariness, perhaps, or a hunger that had nothing to do with food. He introduced himself with a nod, brief and steady, as though words were wasted when a look could do just as well. She felt her breath hitch but brushed it off. A cook had no reason to pay mind to such things. She reminded herself of that as she followed him toward the ranch house. Boots crunching on the gravel path. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and leather. The kitchen was tidy, yet it bore the marks of a man living alone too long. A stack of unwashed plates by the basin, shelves half empty, a pot left with nothing but blackened stew at the bottom. She had work to do, and that was just fine with her. Work kept a person grounded. Work left no room for wondering about the man whose footsteps seemed to echo even after he'd left the room. She tied on her apron, telling herself this was no different than cooking for the boarding house back home. But even then, a part of her knew this wasn't the same at all. The nights on the ranch stretched endlessly. The first evening, she lit the lanterns and carried a tray out to the porch where he sat watching the dark settle over the land. He ate little, thanked her even less, but something about the way his gaze lingered made her uneasy. Not frightened exactly, but unsettled, as though she'd wandered into a story that hadn't revealed its ending yet. Each night it was the same. She cooked, he ate, and then silence filled the spaces between them like an unwelcome guest. Yet under that silence, she felt something building. A tension that had nothing to do with chores or meals. By the third night, she told herself she was imagining things. Men like him, hard men, carved by land, and lost didn't look twice at girls who came only to work. But then came the midnight hour. She had risen from bed to fetch water, her lantern casting a dim glow across the wooden floor. That's when she saw him. He was standing by the window, hat in hand, watching the fields as though expecting someone to ride up at any moment. The light caught his face in a way that made him look both fierce and vulnerable. She nearly turned back, but his voice cut through the stillness. Low and rough. "You think I brought you here just to cook?" The words startled her. She clutched the lantern tighter, unsure what to say. His tone wasn't unkind, yet it carried a weight that made her heart race. He turned then, meeting her eyes with an intensity she had never known. It was as if the quiet ranch, the endless fields, and the cold night air had all conspired to press them closer together. She wanted to speak, to ask what he meant, but no words came. He stepped nearer, slow and deliberate, the floorboards groaning beneath his boots. Her pulse quickened. This was not the conversation she had prepared herself for when she'd taken the job. She thought of the letter that had brought her here: plain words, simple promises of wages and honest work. Nothing in those lines hinted at what was unfolding now. Nothing warned her that the midnight rancher had desires that reached beyond food on the table. The way he looked at her now told a different story. One that had been waiting in the shadows all along. The lantern flickered, casting restless shadows on the walls. She wanted to demand answers, to hold her ground, but another part of her felt drawn into the mystery of him. What did he truly want? Why her? And why now, in the dead of night, when the world outside was so still you could hear the brush of a moth against the glass? He took another step closer, and though her instinct told her to retreat, her feet stayed rooted to the floor. The air between them burned with unspoken questions, each heavier than the last. "You'll find out soon enough," he murmured, almost to himself, as his hand brushed the brim of his hat. He didn't reach for her, not yet. but the promise of something more hung in the space between them, sharp as a knife and soft as a whisper. She swallowed hard, every nerve alive with both dread and anticipation. She had come here for work, but she was beginning to understand that work was only part of why he wanted her here. The rest, whatever it was, remained locked in his steady, unsettling gaze. She thought about the long nights ahead, the meals still to be cooked, the silence that would fall again tomorrow. Yet beneath it all lay a question she could no longer ignore. What would happen when he finally told her what he truly wanted? And more than that, what would she do when faced with the truth? The night offered no answers. Only the sound of the wind against the windows and the steady beat of her heart as the midnight rancher stepped even closer, leaving her to wonder whether she had stepped into a life far more dangerous and far more tempting than she ever imagined. And in that moment, with the lantern light trembling and his shadow falling over hers, she realized her world had already shifted. What began as a simple job in the kitchen was turning into something else entirely. The story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to him too. And though she wanted to look away, she couldn't. Not now. Not when everything she thought she knew was about to be tested by the man who had claimed far more than a hot meal. Would she resist? Or would she discover the midnight rancher's truth before it was too late? The answer lingered in the still air, waiting for the dawn that might never come. The lantern light swayed as though it shared her unease. She held it steady, her hand tight around the handle, but inside she felt anything but steady. His words kept circling in her mind, heavy as a storm cloud. He hadn't said much, not enough to explain himself, yet enough to shift the ground beneath her feet. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, just the ramblings of a tired man at an ungodly hour. But something in the way he looked at her told her otherwise. It wasn't food he was hungry for, not entirely. And whatever it was, she wasn't sure she was ready to face it. She forced her eyes away and moved back toward her small room at the end of the hall. Every creak of the floorboards followed her, every breath of wind outside pressing against the windows like a warning. When she finally shut the door behind her, she leaned against it, her chest rising and falling faster than she wished. She told herself sleep would calm her, that come morning she'd laugh at how easily her nerves could be rattled. Yet the night stretched long, filled with tossing and turning, every sound magnified in the silence of the ranch. She swore she could hear his boots on the floor below, pacing slow and deliberate, like a man keeping watch over secrets too heavy to let rest. Morning came harsh and bright as it always did out there. The sun rose without care for sleepless nights or restless thoughts. She was up before dawn, apron tied, bread rising by the fire. Work had always been her way of steadying herself, and she clung to it now. Still, as she moved about the kitchen, she couldn't shake the memory of the way he had spoken. Each word had seemed measured, as if he was choosing carefully what to let slip. She couldn't decide if that was meant to warn her or protect her. When he finally stepped into the kitchen, hat in hand, she felt the air shift again. He greeted her the way he always did, short, gruff, almost as if speaking was an effort he didn't care for. But she noticed the small things. The way his eyes lingered longer than they should have. The way his jaw tightened before he sat down at the table. He didn't say anything more about the night before, but that silence seemed louder than any words could have been. She wanted to ask, but she knew better. A man like him didn't take kindly to questions, not unless he was ready to answer them. The days turned into a rhythm she hadn't expected. Cooking, cleaning, hauling water, baking bread. Simple chores that should have made the ranch feel ordinary. But nothing felt ordinary. The land itself seemed restless. The wind carried with it whispers of things unsaid, and the nights always felt too long. She caught herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, trying to piece together the puzzle he kept hidden. He worked hard, harder than anyone she'd ever seen. His hands were rough, his back strong, his eyes sharp when scanning the horizon. Yet beneath all that strength was something else, something quiet, something broken. One evening, after supper, she stepped outside to gather the laundry she had hung earlier. The sky was painted in streaks of red and gold, the kind of sunset that could make a person forget their troubles for a moment. But when she looked toward the barn, she saw him. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, his gaze fixed far out on the land as if he was waiting for something to appear. She froze, the basket heavy in her arms, and just watched. He looked like a man carrying the weight of more than his own life. She wondered what haunted him. What story was carved into those lines around his eyes? And why, out of all the people in the world, he had wanted her here? She carried the laundry inside, but the image of him stayed with her. Later that night, she found herself lying awake again, staring at the ceiling. She tried to piece together the clues. The urgency in his voice that night at the window. The way he paced the halls when he thought she was asleep. The constant way his eyes scanned the horizon, as if danger might ride in from the darkness at any moment. This wasn't just about her cooking. He wanted her here for something else, something tied to whatever shadow followed him. She didn't know whether to feel afraid or honored, but she knew one thing: she was already too deep to walk away. The next morning, she worked up the courage to ask him about the ranch. She thought if she could keep the question simple enough, he might offer something. "How long have you been here?" she asked as she set his breakfast on the table. He didn't look up right away, just tore a piece of bread and chewed slow. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Long enough to know the land remembers more than it forgets." He left it at that, and she didn't press further. But those words stayed with her, heavy and strange, like they carried more truth than he wanted her to know. As days passed, she began to notice the ranch itself seemed part of the mystery. The barn, the fences, the fields each carried a sense of being more than they appeared. Once, while sweeping the porch, she found markings carved into the railing, initials long worn down but still visible if you looked close. Another time, in the pantry, she noticed a small wooden box tucked away behind sacks of flour. She thought of opening it but stopped herself. Something about the box felt private, almost sacred, as if it belonged to a part of him she wasn't meant to see. Not yet. Still, curiosity worked at her. She wanted to know what he wasn't telling her. She wanted to understand why she was really there. Each night the silence between them grew louder, each glance across the table more charged. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were careful, deliberate, and always, she felt as though he was watching her with a question he hadn't yet asked. One night, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and stirring the horses in the barn. She rose to check on them, lantern in hand, her nightdress brushing against her ankles. As she pushed open the barn door, the smell of hay and leather filled her nose, but she wasn't alone. He was there, standing in the shadows, his hands gripping the stall door tight. She startled, nearly dropping the lantern, but he only looked at her, his eyes sharp and unreadable. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, "There are things out here you don't see until it's too late." Her breath caught. She wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his tone told her not to. Instead, she nodded, clutching the lantern to her chest. He stepped closer, his presence filling the barn like the weight of a storm about to break. She felt the air thicken, her heart racing again in that all-too-familiar way. He didn't touch her, didn't reach out, but his gaze was enough to pin her in place. She knew then, with a clarity that shook her, that whatever reason he had for bringing her here was tangled in something far bigger than cooking meals or keeping house. She lay awake the rest of that night, listening to the wind batter the ranch and the uneasy quiet inside. Questions swirled faster than she could hold them. Who was he really? What was he waiting for out there in the dark? And why did she feel, despite her fear, that her life was safer near him than anywhere else? The answers hovered just out of reach, wrapped in silence and shadows, leaving her to wonder how long she could live on this knife's edge of mystery before the truth demanded to be known. The ranch had become more than a place of work. It was a cage of secrets, and she was caught inside with a man who claimed much more than supper. Every sunrise brought another day of waiting, another chance for the unspoken to slip into words. Yet the longer it stretched, the more she sensed that when the truth came, it would not come gently. It would come like thunder rolling over the plains, sudden and unstoppable, and when it did, nothing about her life or his would ever be the same. The days on the ranch slipped into one another, yet each one carried its own weight, its own quiet reminder that something was waiting just beyond her reach. She worked the kitchen, hauled water, and kept the fire going. But every task seemed laced with questions that refused to settle. The man she worked for, this midnight rancher, moved through his days with the steady patience of someone used to long silence. Yet behind that calm, she felt a storm building. She couldn't see it, couldn't name it, but she could feel it all the same. At times, she caught fragments of the life he carried before she arrived. A photograph tucked between the pages of a worn Bible on the mantel. A woman's shawl folded carefully in a trunk at the foot of his bed when she passed his open door one afternoon. He never spoke of these things, and she never asked. But the evidence lingered. Someone had lived in this house before her, someone who had left pieces behind. The thought haunted her, especially when she imagined the reasons why those things had been left behind. The rancher's silence only deepened the mystery, and with each passing day, the unspoken tension between them grew heavier. It wasn't only the house that carried secrets. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. One afternoon, while hanging sheets too dry, she saw riders far out on the ridge, just dark shapes against the sky. They lingered there, watching. When she told him later, his face hardened in a way she hadn't seen before. He didn't ask questions. He only saddled his horse and rode out, disappearing into the dust. He returned at dusk, his jaw tight, his shirt marked with sweat and dust, and said nothing about what he had found. But she noticed the rifle leaned against the porch that night, close at hand, as if he was expecting company he didn't welcome. Her curiosity grew sharper. It wasn't only about why he had brought her here anymore. It was about what he was hiding, what danger he might be keeping from her. She told herself she could leave if it became too much, that she wasn't bound to this place. But deep down, she knew she wouldn't walk away so easily. Something about him, about the way he carried his burdens alone, pulled at her. He hadn't asked for her trust, yet she found herself giving it piece by piece, even when she wasn't sure he deserved it. One night, after supper, she lingered longer than usual by the table, hoping he might open up. The firelight cast his features in sharp relief, shadows playing across the lines of his face. She asked softly, "Were those men after you?" For a long time he didn't answer. Then, with his eyes still fixed on the fire, he said, "This land's seen trouble before. Trouble doesn't forget easy." That was all he gave her. But the tone in his voice carried enough weight to confirm her fears. There were enemies out there. Somehow, she was caught in the middle of a life she barely understood. The nights became harder to bear. The stillness of the ranch seemed louder with each passing hour, filled with whispers of threats she couldn't name. Sometimes she thought she heard horses in the distance, or voices carried on the wind. Once, she woke to the sound of footsteps outside her window, but when she lit her lantern, the yard was empty. Each time she told herself it was nothing more than nerves. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting. The rancher carried on as though nothing had changed, though she noticed subtle differences. He spent more time near the barn, checking the horses, keeping his tools close. He began walking the perimeter of the land after supper, scanning the distance like a man preparing for a fight. He never explained, but she knew. Danger was circling closer, and whatever past he was running from was beginning to catch up. She also began to notice how the land shaped, man now her as well. The days were long, filled with the endless labor of keeping a ranch alive, but they grounded her in ways she hadn't expected. She grew stronger hauling water, quicker with her hands in the kitchen, braver when facing the wild isolation of the plains. Yet alongside that strength grew a deeper unease. She was tethered to a man who demanded nothing from her with words, yet claimed everything with his silence. His presence was enough to remind her daily that she was no longer just a hired cook. She was part of something larger, something that had been set in motion long before she arrived. That night, she couldn't close her eyes. Every sound outside felt like a signal, every shadow a threat. She finally lit her lantern and walked to the front room, where she found him sitting with the rifle across his knees, staring into the fire. He didn't look at her, but she sat down beside him anyway. For a long while, they sat in silence, the flames throwing restless light across the walls. Then he spoke, barely above a whisper. "When it comes, it won't come quiet." The words settled deep in her chest, heavy as stone. She knew he was right. Everything they had been circling around, all the fear, all the silence, all the hidden truths, was about to break open. She wanted to ask if they stood a chance, but she kept the words inside. Instead, she sat close, listening to the crackle of the fire. The storm of questions in her mind, louder than the wind outside. The ranch no longer felt like a refuge. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. Each day she rose, knowing it could be the last spent in uneasy peace. Each night she lay awake, waiting for hoofbeats to shatter the silence. The midnight rancher kept his watch, steady and unyielding. But she could see it in him too, the readiness of a man. Standing at the edge of a storm, he couldn't turn back. When dawn finally came, it felt less like a beginning and more like a warning. The land stretched wide and empty, but she knew the emptiness was a lie. Somewhere out there, danger was gathering, drawing closer with every passing breath. The house, the barn, the fields, all of it, stood on the edge of something about to break. And as she looked at him, standing tall in the pale light, rifle in hand, she felt the truth deep inside. The moment they had been waiting for was nearly here. The conflict would not wait any longer. And when it came, it would strike with all the force of the storm that had been building in silence all along. The morning broke with a silence that was too sharp to be ordinary. She rose before the sun, her hands trembling as she tied her apron and tried to focus on the steady rhythm of kneading bread. But her eyes kept shifting to the window, drawn to the emptiness of the land outside. The rancher had been gone since before dawn, riding out to check the ridge. She waited with every muscle tense, listening for the sound of hooves, for the sight of dust rising on the horizon, when he finally returned. His horse lathered and his shirt clinging with sweat. She knew the storm had come. He dismounted without a word, his face grim. "They'll be here before nightfall," he said, his voice flat but heavy. She stood frozen in the doorway, her heart sinking. "How many?" she asked, barely managing the words. He looked at her, eyes shadowed. "Enough." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. He checked and rechecked the rifle, set lanterns near the windows, stacked wood by the door to block the wind if it blew harder. She tried to keep herself busy, but every movement felt meaningless. When she brought water from the well, her hands shook so badly the pail nearly tipped. She wanted to tell him she was afraid, but he already knew. She could see it in the way he watched her, steady but silent, as if her fear was another burden he carried. By the time dusk settled, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The sky burned with fading streaks of red, and the land fell into shadow. She lit the lamps one by one, her heart pounding with every flicker of flame. He stood near the window, rifle across his arms, watching the darkness swallow the horizon. She joined him, close enough to hear the low, steady sound of his breathing. It started with the sound of hooves. Slow at first, distant, then growing louder until the ground itself seemed to tremble. She felt her stomach twist as shapes emerged from the dark riders. More than she could count, their outlines sharp against the faint moonlight. They drew closer, and the sound of leather and metal carried through the night air. She gripped the edge of the table, forcing herself to stand tall, though her knees shook beneath her. The rancher stepped forward, opening the door, his figure framed in the lantern glow. He didn't raise his rifle right away. Instead, he called out, his voice strong and steady, "This land's mine. You've no claim here." His words echoed against the empty fields, met with silence at first. Then a voice rose from the riders, harsh and cutting. "You've stood in our way long enough. Tonight it ends." The next moments blurred together in a rush of sound and motion. Gunfire cracked, horses screamed, and the rancher fired back with deadly precision. She ducked behind the table, her hands covering her ears, her breath ragged. The house shook with the force of the fight, glass shattering, wood splintering. She wanted to run, but she couldn't leave him. Peeking over the table, she saw him standing firm in the doorway, a figure of defiance against the storm that had finally broken loose. The battle stretched on, each shot a drumbeat of fear and survival. At one point she thought she saw one of the riders break through toward the barn, and her heart seized at the thought of them setting fire to it. But the rancher's aim never wavered, his stance unyielding. He moved with the steadiness of a man who had been preparing for this his whole life. Still, she could see the toll, the sweat on his brow. like the tension in his jaw, the strain in every breath. When the gunfire finally slowed, the night was filled with groans and the sound of retreating hooves. The riders scattered back into the darkness, their threat broken, but not entirely gone. She stayed frozen for a long moment, waiting for silence to settle again. When it did, she rushed to him, her hands grasping his arm. "Are you hurt?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He looked down at her, his face worn but steady. "No, not this time." The relief nearly knocked her to her knees. She helped him inside, closing the door against the wind that had picked up again. The house bore scars-shattered glass, bullet holes in the walls, but it still stood, and so did they. She gathered water and cloth, tending to the scrapes on his hands even as he tried to brush her off. "I've had worse," he muttered, but she ignored him, focusing on the small care she could give. Later, when the lamps burned low and the silence outside returned to something closer to peace, she finally found her voice. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. Her words weren't angry, just heavy with everything she had carried in silence. He looked at her for a long time, then finally spoke. "Because I wanted to spare you. But I should have known better. You deserved the truth." The honesty in his tone broke something in her, not with pain but with understanding. She realized then that all along he hadn't brought her here to trap her in his troubles. He had brought her because he couldn't face them alone anymore. And in his own quiet way, he had trusted her with more than the work of the kitchen. He had trusted her with his life. In the days that followed, the ranch settled into an uneasy calm. The threat wasn't gunmen like that, didn't vanish with one fight, but the land felt lighter, as if it had breathed out a long-held sigh. She found herself walking the fields with him, helping mend the fences, carrying water for the horses. The chores no longer felt like burdens. They were pieces of a life she had chosen, though she had never meant to. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky glowed with the kind of colors only the plains could paint, she asked the question that had been lingering in her heart. "What happens now?" He stood beside her, his hat in his hand, his eyes on the horizon. "Now we keep going, one day at a time." It wasn't a grand promise, but it was real. And for the first time since arriving, she felt the weight in her chest ease. The ranch was still scarred, the danger not completely gone, but there was strength in what they had endured together. She realized then that she wasn't just a cook on a lonely ranch. She was part of its story, as much a part of it as the man who had carried its burdens for so long. In the quiet that followed, she found comfort. The land was harsh, the nights long, but it was also a place of survival, of resilience, of trust forged in fire. The midnight rancher had wanted more than meals, more than chores done. He had wanted someone to stand beside him when the storm came. And though she hadn't known it at first, she had wanted the same. As the final light of day faded and the stars began to scatter across the wide sky, she looked at him and felt a steady calm settle in her. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The ranch, once heavy with shadows, now felt like a place where something new could grow, built not on secrets but on trust. And in that moment, with the wind carrying the scent of earth and smoke and the promise of tomorrow, she knew the story had reached its end. Not the end of fear or struggle, but the end of silence, the end of facing it all alone. The midnight rancher had claimed her trust, and in return, she had claimed her place by his side. The land stretched wide around them, endless and untamed, but together it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like home. The night after the fight felt longer than any before. The house was scarred, glass shattered, walls marked, the smell of gunpowder still lingering in the air. She barely closed her eyes, sitting near the fading fire, listening to the creak of the boards and the distant cry of coyotes. The rancher sat across from her, his rifle within reach, his face worn but steady. They had survived, but survival was only the beginning of what came next. She kept replaying the sound of the hooves, the harsh voices, the echo of gunfire that had nearly torn everything apart. The questions she had buried now demanded answers. When morning came, pale light spread across the fields, and the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of dread anymore. It was the silence after a storm, heavy but clean. She stepped outside, the air cool against her skin, and for the first time since arriving, she saw the ranch clearly. The fences broken, the barn marked, the land scarred, yet still standing. The men who came to take it had failed, but she knew others might return. As she breathed in the open air, she realized the truth. This ranch was more than just land. It was a fight for belonging, a fight for something worth holding on to. Inside, he was already working. He had cleared the broken glass, swept the floor, set the table back upright. His movements were slow, his body stiff, but he never complained. She brought water, cleaned the cuts on his hands, and for once, he led her without a word. There was no stubborn refusal, no brushing off her care. That silence told her more than anything he could have said. He trusted her now, not just with his land, but with his wounds, his burdens, his life. Later that day, she finally asked about the shawl in the trunk and the photograph by the Bible. He didn't avoid her eyes this time. He said the shawl had belonged to his wife, long gone, taken by illness that the wide land couldn't heal. The photograph was of her, a reminder he had carried through the years, tucked away but never forgotten. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady, and filled with something between sorrow and acceptance. She listened, her heart aching for the loneliness he had carried, the years of silence that had hardened him. Now, she understood why he had seemed more shadow than man when she first arrived. He wasn't just guarding land. He was guarding memories, holding on to what little he had left. And she asked the harder question. Why bring her here when he knew danger was close? He looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because I couldn't do it alone anymore. Because you were stronger than you knew. The words caught in her chest, raw and simple. But they filled her with something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time. She wasn't just someone passing through. She had been chosen not for her cooking, not for her labor, but for the way she could stand when the storm broke. The days that followed were filled with mending. Together they repaired the fences, fixed the barn doors, and patched the holes in the walls. Neighbors from town came by, some to help, some only to watch, their eyes full of questions they didn't voice. Whispers spread, but she didn't care anymore. What mattered was the work, the land, and the trust built in fire and blood. She began to see the ranch not as a place of isolation, but as a place of belonging. Forged by what they had endured together, she also began to notice small changes in herself. The woman who had first arrived had been wary, uncertain, restless. Now she rose each morning with purpose. She no longer jumped at every shadow, though she still listened carefully to the land, reading its silence as he had taught her. She learned the rhythm of the animals, the strength of the soil, the way to move with the wind instead of against it. The rancher no longer seemed a figure of mystery, but a man carved by hardship, who had finally allowed someone close enough to share the weight. One evening, as the sky turned gold and the first stars blinked awake, she stood beside him near the porch. The fields stretched wide before them, quiet and endless. She asked him if he thought the riders would return. He didn't lie. Maybe, he said, but if they do, they'll find us ready. His voice carried no bravado, only calm truth. She nodded, realizing she wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had been burned out, replaced with something stronger, in town. She heard stories of other ranches lost, of families driven away, of land stolen by men who thought power came only from force. Yet here they were, still standing, and in that strength lay something more than survival. It was defiance. It was the stubborn will to remain, to plant roots deep enough that no storm could tear them free. When the first rains of spring came, she stood in the doorway watching the water soak the dry earth, filling the air with the scent of renewal. The rancher came up behind her, his presence steady as always, and for the first time since she had come, she felt peace. The rain washed away the dust, the smoke, the blood, leaving only the promise of growth, the subplots that had lingered in her mind, the mystery of his silence, the shadow of the woman before her. The question of why she had been chosen all found their answers in quiet moments like these. The silence was not emptiness, but protection. The shawl and photograph were not shackles, but memories of love lost and carried forward. And she had been chosen not by accident, but by a truth he had seen before she did, that she could face the weight of the land, the danger of the world, and not falter. As the seasons turned, the ranch grew stronger. Crops took root, animals thrived, and the scars of the fight faded into the background. She found herself smiling more, humming softly as she worked in the kitchen. Laughter sometimes breaking the stillness that once felt unbearable. The rancher, though still quiet, allowed small pieces of warmth to show an approving nod, a rare smile. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her. In the end, it wasn't grand gestures or dramatic promises that held them together. It was the steady rhythm of life on the land, the trust built in silence, the resilience forged in fire. They had faced the storm and remained, and in that survival lay their future. She knew danger might come again. Men with greed in their hearts did not disappear overnight. But she also knew that whatever came, they would face it side by side. The ranch was no longer just his, no longer a place haunted by shadows of loss. It was theirs now, built on survival, trust, and the kind of quiet strength that outlasts storms. As the sun set one final time on the story that had brought them together, she stood at the porch with him, watching the horizon glow. The land stretched wide, endless and wild, but it no longer felt lonely. It felt like home. The midnight rancher had once been a mystery, a figure in the shadows. Now he was a man she understood, a man who had given her not just work, but belonging. The story ended not with victory shouted loud, but with peace claimed quietly, the kind that lingers long after the storm passes. And as the stars rose above them, she knew that was enough. The land, the trust, the life they had built, this was the lasting truth. It was the resolution of fear into strength, silence into understanding, and survival into a shared home. And with that, the tale of the midnight rancher and the woman who came to cook but found something far greater reached its close, leaving behind not just memories of struggle, but the promise of a life lived together, steady and enduring. Under the wide and endless sky, top of form, bottom of form, one evening, while clearing away the dishes, she found herself alone in the kitchen with him longer than usual. He was quiet, but his eyes followed her every move. Finally, he spoke. "You could have left by now, but you didn't." His words hung in the air, not as a question, but as a statement. She froze, her hands stilling on the tablecloth. There were a dozen reasons she could have given wages, the difficulty of finding work elsewhere, the stubborn pride that kept her from running when things grew hard. But none of those were the real reason, and he seemed to know it. She met his gaze for a brief moment, her breath catching, but she said nothing. The truth between them was too raw to put into words. She began to wonder about the woman whose shawl lay in the trunk, and about the photograph hidden away. Had she too been drawn into the rancher's world, into the storm that followed him? Or had she left when she realized what it would cost? The thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She wasn't sure whether she envied that woman's escape or pitied her absence. Either way, the weight of another life lingered in the walls of the house, pressing against her as though urging her to choose carefully. The conflict only deepened when a letter arrived. She found it tucked under the door one morning, the paper folded rough, the handwriting harsh and jagged. She handed it to him without a word, watching as his eyes scanned the page. His jaw tightened, and for the first time since she had come, she saw something close to fear flash across his face. He crumpled the letter and tossed it into the fire before she could read a word. She wanted to demand answers, but he only said, "It's nothing you need to worry about." The flames devoured the letter, but the unease it carried settled deep in her chest. Whoever had sent it was no friend, and their reach had found its way to the ranch. That night, she heard him pacing again, the floorboards creaking under his weight. She stayed still in her bed, listening to each step, her own pulse echoing in her ears. She knew then that the conflict he carried wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to her too. She was tied to this place, to this man, whether she wanted to be or not. And though he tried to shield her with silence, she felt the edges of danger closing in. Something was coming, and it would not wait much longer. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a battleground of secrets and shadows. She could feel it in the air, in the tension that hung between them, in the way every sound at night seemed to carry a warning. The midnight rancher had claimed more than her cooking, more than her time. He had pulled her into a life where the line between safety and danger was as thin as the whisper of the wind across the plains. And as much as she wanted to deny it, she knew she would stay. Because the story wasn't finished, and neither of them could turn away now. She lay awake that night, staring into the darkness, the rancher's voice echoing in her mind. You could have left by now, but you didn't. The words held both a truth and a promise, one she wasn't sure she was ready to face. And yet, deep in her chest, she knew that when the conflict finally broke wide open, she would be standing in the middle of it, whether by choice or by fate. The wind howled harder that week, as if the land itself knew something was drawing close. She felt it in her bones every morning when she rose before dawn. Kneading bread with restless hands, her ears sharp for every noise outside the kitchen window, the rancher moved with even less words than usual. His eyes hard and scanning the horizon, as though expecting it to spit out an enemy at any moment. She had grown used to his silences, but now they carried a weight that made her chest ache. It was no longer the quiet of a man who preferred solitude. It was the silence of a man waiting for something dark to come. At night she couldn't sleep. She listened to the creak of floorboards as he walked the house, his boots steady, his rifle sometimes catching a faint glimmer from the moon through the window. She lay still, every nerve alive, wondering if this was the night trouble would finally break through their fragile peace. When the wind carried distant sounds, hooves, a shout carried far off, her heart seized. By morning nothing had changed, yet the feeling remained. The land was restless. The walls of the house seemed too thin to keep danger out. One evening, she gathered the courage to ask him what had been burning in her mind since the letter. She found him on the porch, leaning against a post, the sunset bleeding red and orange across the fields. She stepped beside him and said quietly, "Whatever this is, I deserve to know." He didn't answer right away, just tightened his jaw and kept his eyes on the horizon. Finally, he said, "There are men who want this land, men who don't care who they burn out to take it. I've stood in their way too long, and they don't forget." The words chilled her more than the night air. It was what she feared, though hearing it aloud made the danger feel heavier. She thought of the riders she had seen on the ridge, of the letter burned in the fire, of the pacing footsteps in the night. All of it fit together now. But there was still a piece missing. She turned to him and asked, "And me? Why bring me here?" His eyes finally met hers, dark and unreadable, carrying too much for her to untangle. "Because I needed more than someone to cook. I needed someone I could trust." Trust. The word rooted in her, tangled with fear and something she didn't want to name. She had given him her trust long before he asked for it. Now it bound her to him, no matter what storm rolled their way. Days grew heavier with dread. She noticed small signs, hoofprints near the creek, where no rider should have been. Smoke on the far horizon, the uneasy restlessness of the horses in the barn. Each sign spoke of someone drawing closer. She worked harder in the kitchen to keep her hands busy, but her mind wouldn't settle. She found herself checking the doors twice, glancing at the windows, half expecting a shadow to appear outside at any moment. The rancher carried himself like a man ready for war. His rifle never left arm's reach. He sharpened his knife at the table while she baked, the scrape of metal on stone setting her teeth on edge. He mended fences long after sundown, lantern light glowing faint in the dark. She wanted to tell him to rest, to eat more than the bites he picked at, but she knew better. He was preparing. Preparation was all that stood between them and whatever waited out there. One afternoon, she followed him out to the barn. He was saddling his horse, movements swift and precise. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Into town." "Need to know how close they are?" Fear twisted in her stomach. "You shouldn't go alone." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might tell her no. But instead he said, Then stay close. The ride into town was quiet, both of them alert to every sound on the trail. The land stretched wide around them, but it didn't feel open. It felt crowded with shadows. In town, the streets were too still, men watching from porches with eyes that spoke more than words. Whispers followed them, and she knew the rancher was right. Trouble was moving closer. On the ride back, he kept a hand near his gun, his gaze sweeping the land as if expecting riders to break from the hills at any moment. That night, thunder rolled far off, but no rain followed. She sat by the window long after the lamps were out, watching the land under the moonlight. She thought she saw movement near the tree line, a flicker of something that wasn't wind or shadow. She wanted to wake him, but she stayed quiet, her breath shallow, her body tense. The longer she watched, the more certain she became that eyes were on the house. Watching, waiting. The tension bled into everything. Even the simplest chores felt like carrying weight too heavy for her shoulders. She found herself listening for hoofbeats while she kneaded bread, glancing over her shoulder while drawing water. At night, the silence pressed down so hard she sometimes whispered to herself just to hear a voice. But the rancher seemed to thrive in it, his presence steady, his movements deliberate. She began to wonder if this was the life he had always known, conflict hovering just out of sight, danger a part of every breath. One evening, the unease broke into something sharper. They were sitting at the table when a sound cracked across the night air, a gunshot, distant but close enough to rattle the windows. Her hands froze on the tablecloth, and her heart slammed against her ribs. He rose instantly, his chair scraping back, his eyes cutting toward the door. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice low but firm. She wanted to argue, to say she wouldn't let him face whatever it was alone. But the look in his eyes rooted her to the floor. He stepped out into the night, rifle in hand, his figure swallowed by the dark. She stood frozen in the kitchen, the silence after the shot louder than any thunder. Minutes dragged like hours, each creak of the house making her flinch. When he returned, his face was grim. "They're closer than I thought," he said, his voice tight. He didn't explain more, but the set of his shoulders told her enough. The conflict wasn't at the edges anymore. It was right at their door.